story I'm going to tell you today is about private philanthropy, which is really one of America's most distinctive contributions to modern culture. It's just not something you find in the same forms or the same scale anywhere else in the world. And I have a high goal for us this evening. I'm really hoping to persuade you that in our country, philanthropy is much more than, kind of a nice civilizing coat of paint on the national mansion. It is instead a deep part of our foundation and of our very structure. And I'm going to present some evidence to you that philanthropy is crucial in making America the unusual country that it is. So let's start with some brute numbers here. Our nonprofit sector now employs 11% of the U.S. workforce. As these things go, that's quite significant, obviously, and this 6% of GDP that is represented by our nonprofit workforce is also quite representative. And this skips, by the way, the value of volunteer labor. If you put a monetary figure on the volunteer labor, it would be even larger. To give you a little bit of perspective on that official GDP figure, here is the number for the fabled military-industrial complex, which is, of course, often used as a shorthand for a formidable industry. Well, guess what? The charitable sector passed the military-industrial complex in size way back in 1993 and continues to grow beyond it. Information like that, alas, is often missing from discussions today in public discussions, from journalism, from academic analysis, from politics, certainly. So many people are surprised when they encounter realities like this one, which show that America's most generous cities are not New York or San Francisco as they expect, but rather the communities of basically Mormon America and the Bible Belt is what you're looking at. And this is a fair comparison. This is basically how much skin you have in the game. This is giving as a percentage of what you have to give. It's not total. Obviously, New York is going to be bigger than anybody just because it's a huge city, but this is giving as a percentage of what's available to you to give. Anyway, this is just a kind of a simple representative fact to try to make the point that all kinds of essential facts about philanthropy are mostly unreported in this country, and as a result, our citizens don't have a true sense of the size of the sector or the consequence and role that it plays in our national health. And when I realized this, when I was at the Philanthropy Roundtable, we finally decided to do something about that. So what we did was produce this book. It was a multi-year effort, and it includes all kinds of things like a Philanthropist Hall of Fame, which had never been produced before. There are about 1,000 of the greatest, or at least most consequential philanthropic achievements in the nation, chronicled in the book. There's a rich collection of quotations. There's a timeline that lays out about 350 years of charitable action in America and a lot more. And it's really a very lively collection of Americana is the main thing. And we're very excited that it will fill some gaping holes in the national self-awareness. And I promise you, it will not make you sleepy. If you have small children at home and they happen to crack its covers, they will not run to you crying. And the reason is basically the human interest element. There are just Iliads and Odysseys of human interest in this book. Take, for instance, this character. This is a man named Ned McLuhan. Ned was born and raised on a Louisiana bayou. His garb here, as you may notice, is not typical Louisiana costume. They don't even dress like that at Mardi Gras, so far as I know. But McLuhan had a kind of a Forrest Gump life, and at this particular phase, he was actually an Arctic explorer. Did some very interesting things in Alaska. He came home and he wrote a book on alligators. He wrote another book on wild turkeys. As an ornithologist, he personally banded about 250,000 birds. Just one of these guys with a million interests and appetites. Here he is all grown up. At this point, I'm sure he's, paying for life insurance and doing all those responsible things that men capitulate to when they take off their furs and they put on their bow ties, because Ned McLuhan had a day job, which was manufacturing and selling the hot pepper condiment invented by his family. And let me tell you, there is real money in burning people's tongues. And McLuhan used his profits for an amazing array of good works. For one thing, he got very attached to a fellow native of Louisiana's bayous, the snowy egret. When McLuhan was young, some of you may have run across this history. There's just this craze, an absolute fashion craze for snowy egret feathers in women's hats. And I've tried to think of a contemporary analogy. I don't know enough about fashion, but it's kind of the Jimmy Choo shoes or the Coach handbag or something. You know, mania, women beating each other over the heads to get one of these things. And the result of this was you had, and this is, that's the wrong button. Here's the right button. This is the kind of headgear that resulted, which, this one is very fetching, I think you'd have to agree. Some of the other ones were a little bit less understandable. And then there were the clearly mistaken ones, and then there were just the completely indefensibles. You know, but all of these were very common in the 20s, and guess what? They resulted in a huge run on snowy egrets, just a huge death march for snowy egrets. You can also probably guess that they were never knocked off by the Chinese like Coach handbags have been, just because they're so distinctive. But these were silly fashions, but they had a very unsilly effect, which was to make the snowy egret almost extinct. And when he realized this, the philanthropist inside Ned McLuhan's breast swung into action. So the first thing he did, his family owned an island, still owns an island in Louisiana, and so he went out and literally beat the bushes for 2 full days and managed to find 8 baby egret chicks, and literally stuffed them in the pockets of his hunting coat and went home. Here are the chicks. He put these in a protected area and raised them up for a period of years. And at the same time he was doing that, he convinced some of his philanthropist friends, namely John Rockefeller, Olivia Sage, a few other folks like that, to buy up swampy areas of Louisiana, which were important to the egrets as nesting areas, and other waterfowl as well. And in this fashion, Ned McLuhan managed to rescue a really magnificent creature that was literally on the verge of disappearing from the earth. Same time, just about the same time he was doing this, he was getting into all kinds of other things. And one of the really fascinating aspects for me was when I realized later on in his life he acted to kind of short circuit another kind of extinction, a very different kind of extinction. He had been raised with Negro Spirituals in his ears, and he just loved them. He absolutely loved the songs. And around the time of his 60th birthday, as best I can tell, he started to notice that they were just dying out. People did not know the words, did not know the music. You have to remember, these were an oral tradition. These had not been written down. And again, he kind of realized that this was at risk of being forgotten forever, so he just sprang into action. And like before, it wasn't just his checkbook he used, it was also his personal involvement. The first thing he did was to track down these 2 ladies who lived quite nearby, actually, and he managed to find these elderly singers who still remembered many of the old spirituals. And then McLuhan, hired a musicologist, and he and the musicologist sat down with these 2 ladies and asked them to sing their hearts out, and madly scribbled as fast as they could, and they wrote down all the lyrics, all the melodies, all the harmonies, and recorded these songs for history exactly as they had been handed down from generation to generation of slaves in order to preserve them. He then published these as a book, which became a classic of the genre. There are 125 songs in this book, and I've worked hard to try to figure out how many of them were preserved anywhere else, and it looks like only 5 or 6 were saved elsewhere. So, in other words, about 120 really precious pieces of Americana here were saved for future generations single-handedly by this gentleman's effort. And by the way, the songs that he saved included the one that Martin Luther King Jr. quoted in his most famous passage when he talked about free at last, thank God Almighty I'm free at last. That was one of McLuhan's songs, and very possibly one we would not have known and King would not have known absent this effort. So just think what a tragedy it would have been to have this music, it's more than music, it's artifacts of American culture, really, be lost to history. But that's the kind of wonderful idiosyncratic work that philanthropy can do. Here is another red-blooded American philanthropist who helped keep his fellow citizens lastingly free. Alfred Loomis was really passionate about science, just from absolute little boyhood, just loved it. And wanted to make it his life's work, but realized that doing it on the scale he aspired to would take an independent fortune. So he jumped into money-making in Wall Street, and to compress a really fascinating story that I tell more fully in the book, but don't have time for now, he financed, a firm he set up, financed most of the rural electrification of America, and then he anticipated the stock market crash just brilliantly, and by the early 1930s, he was one of the wealthiest men in America. So at that point, he completely retired from finance and put all of his energy and most of his money into science, as he said he would. He bought the mansion across the street from his home in suburban New York. And he set up just a tremendous science lab in this mansion, better equipped than almost any university lab in the entire country. And he was not a dabbler. He did very distinguished work there himself. One of his specialties was the precise measurement of time. He did some acoustic work. He was one of the first people to discover and categorize brain waves. He invited lots of scientists over from Europe and from America to work with him. As I say, it was not dabbling. It was very serious science. Then, in 1938, Alfred Loomis went to Berlin. And two things really struck him there. First of all, how popular Hitler was. And second of all, how good the German scientists were. And he came home very scared. He was convinced that war was brewing and that science was going to have a lot to do with who won. So he really went to work. He thought hard and long about what scientific applications might have defense uses. And he quickly settled on using radio waves to detect moving objects. And his lab very quickly became the national leader in what we now call radar, which at that point didn't exist. And not only did he do the theoretical work behind this, but he started overseeing the production of radar sets, practical, usable radar sets. And the radar sets that Loomis helped produce were delivered to the U.S. military in the thousands and put into ships and airplanes and other devices, and just had a tremendous effect on the course of the war. Even more than it is his money, it was Loomis's method, his philanthropic method, that really accounted for his remarkable successes. He had actually had a little stint in World War I where he worked in one of the government weapons R&D labs. I think he was in Aberdeen. I can't remember, but he was just appalled by how sluggish and how bureaucratic these labs were. They were literally saying, "Oh, we know atomic weapons are important, but that's the next war's worry." And he's saying, "No, it isn't. It absolutely is not. You have to get on this right now." So when it became apparent how brilliantly successful Loomis's method was in producing radar, they realized we need that guy on the atomic bomb. So his entire method was just lifted up and dropped into the Manhattan Project. Again, I can't get into the details here, but and most of his scientists, too, by the way, were transferred directly from his lab over to the Manhattan Project. So he is functionally really a father of the atomic bomb as well as radar. He personally made the cyclotron that Ernest Lawrence purified all the uranium for the bombs. Loomis made that happen. He basically used his industrial connections and his philanthropic money to find the stockpiles of copper and iron and stuff that were necessary to build this gigantic industrial machine in the middle of a wartime shortage. So just a really brilliant record. And then the cherry on top for me when I was doing this research was I realized that it wasn't only his this kind of entrepreneurial philanthropic method that he devised that lives on today. He also left behind a flesh and blood embodiment of this style. His great-grandson, it turns out, is this guy. I don't know if anybody recognizes that face. That is Reed Hastings, who, like his great-grandfather, is a huge game changer today in both business and philanthropy. He was the founder of Netflix, which by my calculations has now disrupted 3 major industries in the U.S. And on the philanthropic side, he is the progenitor, one of the great progenitors of charter schools in this country. Another entrepreneurial philanthropist who put really deep imprints on America was this man. That's George Eastman, who, as founder of Kodak, popularized photography in the early 1900s. When Eastman began, the photographic process was just all guesswork. I mean, there was just very little science involved. For instance, there's some remarkable stories about during the early startup phase of his company, when he was literally sleeping in a hammock in the corner of the warehouse, kind of trying to get the business ramped up. There was a period of time of a few weeks where there was just a calamitous series of failures of the gelatin, the industrial gelatin that was used to develop the photos. And people were sending in their photos and they were coming out black for a few weeks. And it was going to kill the company if he didn't fix this fast. So he was frantic, as you can imagine. It eventually turned out, they finally tracked down that the cows whose carcasses were boiled down to make industrial gelatin, I don't know if you know that's where gelatin comes from, but it is. These cows had been moved to new pastures where there was a lack of sulfur in the grass that they were eating. And that tiny missing element was enough to just wreck this delicate chemistry of photography. So when he figured this out, you can imagine, he said, that is never going to happen to me again. I'm going to master the basic science here so I know what's going on. So he started hiring chemists from an obscure little school in New England called Boston Tech. And he had some very good experiences with these well-trained minds who came to him. And in gratitude, he later funded the transformation of Boston Tech into today's MIT. He built this building and all of the rest of the MIT campus where it now stands, where it now resides, and he is to a very large degree responsible for making this the great school that it is today. Passion plays a big role in philanthropy, a very big role, and a very legitimate role in my judgment. One of George Eastman's passions was music. He, for instance, had a full-size pipe organ installed in his home in Rochester, and he hired a guy to come in every morning and play it to wake him up. It was literally his alarm clock, you know, toccatas and fugues to wake up. That sounds like the life. But he just loved music in so many ways. There's a wonderful journal entry where I read one of his friends who accompanied him on a trip to New York City where they took in 12 operas in 6 days. And her summary in the journal was, George is absolutely alcoholic about music, which is a good way of putting it. And this passion for music in George Eastman led to one of the really great cultural gifts in all of American history. He just willed into existence, methodically created and built to world prominence the Eastman School of Music in Rochester. The Eastman School was really important in Americanizing classical music and in popularizing classical music. You know, in those days, if you wanted to become a conductor, you had to go to Europe or a great player, and there just was no tradition here. And Eastman, to some extent, single-handedly helped overcome that. In addition, this auditorium, their main auditorium at the school, was very important in transforming film from a really kind of a cheap, vulgar undertaking at that point to an art form, at least potentially an art form. That happened here. He hired classical music orchestras to play between the reels of silent movies and did other things that helped get that transformation started. Another very idiosyncratic donor who poured money into world-changing research was Kathryn McCormick. By the way, I only noticed after I put this slide into my slideshow that I think she's wearing egret feathers, which means we have dueling philanthropists here. So it's the way it goes sometimes. Anyway, I think a lot of you probably know that philanthropy has been important in medical breakthroughs. I mean, a lot of people know that the polio vaccine, for instance, was a philanthropic project. But how many of you know that the birth control pill was the creation of a sole public funder? And you're looking at her. Kathryn McCormick was a reaper of the International Harvester Fortune. That was her money. And she was an early women's rights activist. I have to say she was more than a little bit crazy, but she was very determined to make a difference in the world and very talented. And at one point she made it her quest to find some means of preventing pregnancy as easy as taking a daily aspirin. That was the kind of that was the assignment. And she eventually put the current equivalent of about $20 million by my math of her money into this, she was the, I don't mean she helped, I don't mean she worked, I don't mean she sent a few grants, she was the sole and entire funder of this entire project. She hovered over the lab constantly. She had significant science training herself. And by 1957, she and her scientific partners had an FDA-approved pill. She absolutely reveled in this accomplishment. At one point, she even walked into a local pharmacy and got a script filled for her own prescription, even though at this point she was a matron in her 80s. So this is I think she just wanted to feel that kind of little, you know, that little pang of donor pride that you get when you do something like that, I guess. The Ford Foundation, which you're looking at here, people don't realize the Ford Foundation was actually based in Southern California for a while. It was once described by Dwight McDonald as, quote, a large body of money completely surrounded by people who want some. And you know, you look at a big pile of silver like the Ford Foundation or like, you know, a lot of these wealthy donors I've just been describing, and you think, well, that's American philanthropy. That's what it's all about. Actually, philanthropy in the U.S. is not just a story of moguls. In fact, it's not even primarily a story of moguls. Least of all is it a story of big foundations. I don't know if you realize, these are the figures from the latest year. Only 14% of charitable giving in the U.S. comes from foundations. And only 5% more comes from corporations. So the rest, more than 80%, comes from individuals. And the bulk of that, by the way, comes from small to moderate individuals at an annual rate of about $2,500 per household. So it's a mass phenomenon, and that's the real money. I mean, people think the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation is huge and it's the biggest foundation ever, and it has an important influence. But you realize Gates gives away about $4 billion a year. The cash giveaway every year in this country is about $360 billion. And then the value of volunteer time is about that much more. So they are a drop in the bucket. They are a very small slice of American philanthropy as a whole. So to make sure that this really crucial reality doesn't get overlooked, I do some extended storytelling in the Almanac of American Philanthropy about real-life small givers. I'm going to introduce you to just a few of the folks that I uncovered. These two lovely people, I'm sorry about the terrible photo, this is the only one that existed, but these are real people from upstate New York named Gus and Marie Selensky. Gus was a plumber, and Marie was a nurse, and they lived quietly until just a few years ago in Syracuse, New York. Their one indulgence was weekly square dancing. I think that's the outfits they're wearing right there is their square dancing gear. And other than that, they were savers, very fastidious savers. And when they died, this simple couple left more than $3 million to good causes. Ann Scheiber was a shy auditor who retired in 1944 with $5,000 in the bank, total. She was also a frugal liver, and through frugal living and some very inspired stock picking, she managed to turn that into $22 million by the time she passed away at the age of 101. And she left every penny of that to Yeshiva University so that poor girls could go to medical school and to college. Eleanor Sauerwein was kind of everybody's mom. She painted her own home. She kept a vegetable garden. She mowed the lawn herself until she was in her 90s in order to save money. Her financial advisor reported that, quote, her goal for years and years was to amass as much as she could so that it could go to the Salvation Army. And when Eleanor died in 2011, she left $1.7 million to the Modesto, California branch of the Salvation Army. Albert Lexie shined shoes in Pittsburgh, right? He was a shoe shine guy until very recently. He did it for more than 50 years. And back in 1981, he decided he was going to give every penny of his tips to the free care fund of the Pittsburgh Children's Hospital. I don't know what the motivation was, but it was a pledge he kept. The fund benefits, as you might expect, families who need care for their child but can't afford it. And he ended up donating more than $200,000 to Children's Hospital, which was about a third of his total earnings, by the way, over that period of years. Now, you may hear critics say, in response to stories like this, well, those are lovely tales, Karl, but this kind of small dispersed giving can never do anything large or consequential, can never achieve anything really important. But the very clear verdict of American history is that those doubters are wrong. They're very, very wrong. Many remarkable things have been done through our history by dispersed giving, which often aggregates in very formidable ways. The author Daniel Borstein, I'm sure some of you have read, once noted that the state of Ohio, with just 3 million inhabitants in 1880, had 37 colleges. All right? 3 million people in 1880 had 37 colleges in Ohio. That very same year, in England, the entire nation of England, which has 23 million people, how many colleges do you think they had? Grand total of 4. So, you know, what explains that? Well, basically the difference is small-scale education philanthropy. Let me show you the picture. This is the colleges that existed in Ohio in 1826. Now, at that point, Ohio was the frontier. All right, that was the West. That was the Wild West. And I picked 1826 because it was the year that Case Western Reserve University was founded. Western Reserve eventually became quite a powerhouse in science. I think something like 16 Nobel Prize winners have been associated with it. Lots and lots of prominent businesses you would have heard of came out of Case Western. But when it was created, at this point, it was basically a little dot that was built up solely through sacrificial giving by its neighbors, by lots of local little people on the Ohio frontier. I read the stories of one supporter, for instance, who it was a farmer with some wagons and horses, and during the winter, when those wagons and horses weren't busy, he hauled stone from a local quarry for the college. That was his contribution. He did it all winter, every year. There was another local family who pledged a certain fraction, several, who pledged a fraction of their egg sales or their milk sales to the college. And again, it sounds like, well, that's not world class. Well, it adds up, and it did add up in the case of this college. and lots of others. Starting around the 1840s, I discovered hundreds of Eastern churches decided that they wanted to pool together little donations, very small donations, but pool them together and send them west to places like this. And within 30 years, those churches had raised more than $1 million that nurtured 18 new colleges. And here's the slide of Ohio after that campaign had been going for about 25 years. Again, lots and lots of places, many of which have become quite important to our nation. And this same story, by the way, played out in many other parts of our country. I just chose Ohio because I had good data for this. Now I want you to fast forward, please, to 2015. And, you know, don't lose your capacity to be startled when you think about this. Today, there are 50 separate different American colleges that are in the midst of a fundraising campaign that will raise at least $1 billion in donations, in freely given donations. And private gifts are now important not just to private colleges, but to public institutions as well. I don't think you realize that state institutions like the University of Virginia or the University of California, Berkeley are now heavily dependent upon voluntarily given revenues. And, here are the figures for the latest year. You'll note that UVA has a lot more gift income than state funding, and Berkeley has more gift income than state funding, even though these are prominent state public universities. And by the way, lots and lots of interesting philanthropic sub-innovations underlie this. For instance, I didn't realize until I got into this research that the endowed chair, which is of course a huge part of the reason our universities are successful and preeminent in the world, the endowed chair is basically an invention of American philanthropy. And even today it's very rare in other parts of the world. I recently spoke at the University of Kentucky. And they had just, excuse me, they had just received a $23 million gift to build a new honors college. This is the gentleman who gave the money. His name is Tom Lewis. And so I was interested because I just happened to be there. He's a successful home builder. And the interesting thing to me was he'd made his money in Arizona, right? And he'd lived almost his entire adult life in Arizona. And he'd gone to college himself in North Carolina. So I thought, why Kentucky? What's going on here? So I had to pester a lot of people, but I finally figured out. It turns out that all 16 of his great-grandparents were Kentuckians. So he felt a personal connection. He felt something special in his family that he wanted to act on. And that's a very good example of a point that I want to make next, which is that in our country, giving has always been very personal. Not just big giving, but all giving. I'm going to talk about this guy to try to illustrate this a little bit. This is a Broadway lyricist named Michael Brown. And Broadway lyricist is a good way to go broke in a normal year, but once in a while you get lucky, and he got lucky in 1956. He had an unexpected hit musical under his belt, and he was feeling a burst of prosperity. And for their Christmas celebration that year, he and his wife and their 2 boys invited a friend, a young writer who was far from her home in South Carolina, and they wanted to share their good fortune. And toward the end of their gift exchange, the Browns handed this woman an envelope. And inside the envelope was a note that read, "You have 1 year off from your job to write whatever you please. Merry Christmas." And the writer's name was Harper Lee. And Harper Lee, when she decided she wanted to become a writer, did what most people do. She left Mississippi, she went to New York City. And when she got there, she did what most people do. She ended up spending more time trying to pay the rent than she was writing, and she was getting nowhere in her craft. In her case, she was working in a bookstore and an airline office. And the Browns noticed this, right? They noticed this, and in a very personal act of philanthropy, I would say it was philanthropy, they decided to act on it, to do something about it. And with their donation in hand, Harper Lee quit both of those jobs, and during that gift year, she wrote To Kill a Mockingbird. It, of course, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1961, and it became one of the most influential books of all time. Much of the power and the beauty of American philanthropy, for me at least, derives from the vast range of causes that have been underwritten by our millions of donations. I don't know how many of you realize that these are, the homes of some of our greatest founding fathers. These are among our country's top cultural treasures. Do you realize that every one of them are preserved not by the National Park Service or some other public organ, but by privately funded nonprofits? Mount Vernon, George Washington's Mount Vernon was saved from ruin by thousands of small donors from what's called the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. The ladies noticed this, and they jumped in there, and they saved this place, and they continue to run it, and they are doing a spanking job. Last I knew, their annual budget is about $40 million a year, and the place is just completely thriving, still under the aegis of the Ladies Association. Monticello, which is sometimes described as Thomas Jefferson's greatest creation, has been protected and interpreted to visitors for more than a century by a private foundation that receives no public funding, none. Same is true for Montpelier, which is the nearby home of the father of our Constitution, James Madison. And one I just discovered a couple years ago, a fascinating story, is the summer cottage where Abraham Lincoln spent about a quarter of his presidency, actually, I figured out. You see it in the bottom right corner there. He made some of his most momentous decisions in this house, including drafting much of the Emancipation Proclamation on its back porch. For years, it was just completely neglected. People had forgotten how important this place was to him. The White House in those days, some of you may know, was just an absolute mayhem. You could walk in the front door, and people did all the time. So poor Lincoln got no rest, and he was such a responsive human being. He couldn't say no to anybody. So when he really wanted to relax or work on something serious, he and the family went up to this cottage, which is up in Northeast. So anyway, this was, as I say, moldering away until a group of private donors came along and restored it to the public and opened it in 2008. It's really just a fascinating bit of our history. And the same thing, by the way, is true about all kinds of other places. I mean, in fact, most of the great historical sites you can think of. Williamsburg, Mystic Seaport, Greenfield Village, Old Salem, all of those are products of private philanthropy. Our great cathedrals and churches are, in many, many cases, products of private philanthropy. The one you're looking at here, which is St. John the Divine in Manhattan, was a classic example. Started with a big gift from a big guy, which was J.P. Morgan, gave the initial donation, but that merely got it launched. And then the real heavy lifting was done over a period of generations, really, by lots and lots and lots of small donations that trickled in, and work was done as these donations pooled up. Our cathedrals of human learning, which is what I would call libraries, are another fruit of private philanthropy. This is the New York Public Library Reading Room that you are looking at right here. And not only it, but all of America's public libraries initially were created by donors. And today, U.S. public libraries have about 1.5 billion visitors each year. Many of our magnificent parks are also fruits of philanthropy. The list of national parks sparked by donors is very long, and it starts here with Maine's Acadia and goes to the Virgin Islands National Park. This is Grand Tetons and Great Smoky. All of these were basically launched by private donors. As we speak, the really interesting thing going on in parks today is urban parks. Some of you may remember that when Central Park was just falling apart and becoming a dangerous place and not being very well used, a couple of private donors came along and didn't just give money. They gave money, but they also gave a new management structure to the park. They insisted that a 501c3 was going to take over management of the park from the city. That was a condition of their gift. And this conservancy just had tremendous effects. The visitation of Central Park is up about 4.5 or 5 times since then. It's a beautiful place again today, as you know, and a huge part of the city life. That conservancy model was so tremendously effective, it's become extremely influential. It's been copied all over the country, and there are just parks, beautiful, wonderful oases for urbanites in all kinds of places. Some of you have probably been to the High Line in Manhattan. The Discovery Green in Houston would be another example. There's a $350 million park being built right now in Tulsa with George Kaiser's money. There's a trail in Chicago called the 606. There's all kinds of these things going on, all completely driven by private philanthropy. Private supporters have been at the center of some miraculous recoveries of numerous endangered species, too. This is, again, not always well appreciated. This is the peregrine falcon, one of my favorite creatures on Earth, and when it's flying, this is the fastest living being when it flies. But when it's reproducing, this is a real snail. They were just not reproducing at anything like a necessary rate, and they were flirting with extinction. Government biologists tried and tried and tried to speed up the breeding rates, but repeatedly failed. And then along came this really wonderful odd marriage of a grant from the IBM Corporation, right, Mr. Button-Down, blue tie, and a whole bunch of small donations from falconry hobbyists. you know, the people that wear the leather gloves and catch the birds and fly them. So this weird, odd couple got together and started not only giving money, but producing some very unconventional ideas for experimental ways of overcoming this problem with the peregrines. And somebody had the bright idea, you know, peregrines love heights and pigeons. Where do you think might be a good place to try to start the comeback? City skyscrapers, somebody said. And it sounded like a crazy idea, but guess what? There are peregrines all over this country at this point, up in urban penthouses, up in the tops of buildings. It turned out to be a brilliant idea. Donor ideas and donor funds were crucial in the comebacks of all kinds of other animals. There's some really fascinating stories. I don't have the time to tell you, but the wolf, the bluebird, classic grassroots philanthropy. The wild turkey was basically hunters who brought back the wild turkey. The whooping crane, unbelievable story of a major donor who just did all kinds of things, not just his money, but again, it was his talent and his insights. He was the guy who figured out that once the birds have been reestablished in the U.S., they have to be taught to migrate. The first time, they don't know how to do it. Once they've done it once, they can migrate again, but somebody has to show them the first time. And this guy was an amateur pilot, and he said, let's use one of those ultralight airplanes to fly them to Florida. And again, it sounded absolutely mad, and it was not the kind of thing that most government bureaucrats are going to volunteer their agency to try, but it was actually quite successful. Philanthropy is actually terribly important in science in general. I mean, all kinds of science. You're looking right here at a telescope that I don't know if you realize almost all of the famous telescopes in this country. I mean, starting way back with the Lick and the Yerkes observatories, and then Mount Wilson and Mount Palomar and today's Keck telescopes, all of those really great high-end instruments were filled with light by private money. And that continues today. The two really massive instruments under construction right now are the Giant Magellan and the so-called 30-meter telescope. And both of those are products of donations. And I mean big donations. I mean, like this one, this is the 30-meter. This was created by a $250 million gift by the founder of Intel Corporation, Gordon Moore. He slapped that down to design and kick off the process. Certain large areas of philanthropy have been especially hard spurred by donors. Medical research is a perfect example. Back in 2013, Philanthropy Magazine, which I oversee, we did a special investigation of some of the pioneering funding for medical research that John Rockefeller did. And we found that an astonishing 61 separate Nobel Prize winning scientists had been boosted up with Rockefeller money. The breakthroughs that were made by these folks were all kinds of important things. Blood typing came out of that, penicillin came out of that, the yellow fever vaccine came out of that, you know, nerve signaling, fundamental genetic things that we know now, all grew out of that very, very seminal funding from John Rockefeller, which began, by the way, because he lost a grandson to scarlet fever. Again, very personal motivation, but he jumped in there and he helped a lot of other people out of that tragedy. Another area where charitable efforts are extremely important is foreign assistance. Very few people know that private U.S. philanthropic funds sent overseas now substantially exceed the official foreign aid of our government. These are the numbers for the latest year available. You can see that in 2011 we had $39 billion of private donations for overseas poor folks and $31 billion of government aid. And it isn't just the quantities that matter, by the way. In all fields, as I've already hinted, I think, private giving tends to work in very different ways from public funding. Philanthropy tends to be more experimental. It's quicker. It's more efficient. In general, it's much more varied and much more personalized. Let's take the last thing. Let's take personalization, for instance. Many of the most interesting and successful mechanisms in the charitable world. And I'm thinking about things like micro-lending circles or you know, mentoring programs, or the Posse Foundation, which keeps kids from dropping out of college, or Alcoholics Anonymous. These all rely very heavily on individualized solutions, on the one-to-one human accountability. And what they're really doing is taking advantage of all the useful information that becomes at your fingertips if you actually know someone, instead of just dealing with a stranger. And by creating personal rather than impersonal transactions, they use the power of relationships to change behavior. And that's powerful. Mother Teresa used to say that, I never think about crowds. I think about individuals. And that's kind of a philanthropist's credo. On the other hand, the administrator of a government program has to think about the crowd. They almost can't think about the individual. Government programs are all about equal opportunity. They're all about treating everyone the same. You can't have different approaches for different kinds of people, even though that would very often work better. Now, this consistency of government programs sometimes gets romanticized. It's very easy to romanticize because it's big, it's clearly defined, it's out there, and people look at philanthropy and they say, what a crazy quilt in comparison. But, consistency is really not how human beings work. If you have one child, for instance, in your family who needs a very structured environment, and another one who only blooms when really given the freedom to kind of explore his or her own boundaries. You don't want one size fits all. You don't want consistent schools. You want individualized services that recognize and work with the intimate differences between different kinds of personalities. And you'll have a very hard time finding that in any government program, almost by definition. But it is a hallmark of philanthropic efforts. Which leads us to this great $50 word that every American really ought to know, in my opinion, which is polyarchy. Polyarchy refers to a society in which there are many independent sources of power, okay? The easy way to remember it is just contrast it to monarchy. It's kind of the opposite of monarchy. Now, the United States obviously has a notably polyarchic culture. And I would argue that independent philanthropic giving is a really big aspect of this. You can think of all those givers and all those nonprofits as like mini legislatures. They're deciding what matters, what needs fixing, what's important in our society, and they're acting. It's a very, very dispersed style of authority and action. Yale Law professor Stephen Carter, a thinker I admire, points out that everyone measures community needs with what he calls different calipers, and that millions of individual charitable decisions are going to lead to much more variety and much more diverse spending and much better protection of non-mainstream points of view than a single government program can or ever could. And for this reason, Carter refers to philanthropy as, quote, democracy in action. That's his phrase. And I think it's an apt one. Now, the fact that most philanthropy takes place on a local level and usually out of the public eye, sometimes it's very private and often even anonymous, means that it's really easy to overlook the kind of actions I've been describing to you here. Most of us never see more than just a few fragments, a few very small fragments of the overall kind of private giving iceberg. Even people in the business themselves lose track of its import and its size and its scope. And the result is that we grossly underestimate the problem-solving power of charitable action and how valuable it is to our nation. So not surprisingly, there are lots and lots of out-and-out critics who kind of go out of their way to discount the idea that major public concerns can be addressed via private responses. And, the message is sort of, yeah, philanthropy's cute. I'm not against it. It's a lovely little thing. But if you're serious and you really want to solve a problem, get big and get governmental or go home. That's the clear message. One of the criticisms you will hear about philanthropy is this one, that philanthropy is just a drop in the bucket. Now, I want to remind you, when I started this talk, I showed you those figures about the U.S. nonprofit sector now being much bigger than the military-industrial complex. So kind of keep that in mind. But let me throw a few more additional tidbits out there. I don't know if you know that the Gates Foundation alone, which is, as I've already told you, is only a tiny sliver of our overall entire philanthropic apparatus. The Gates Foundation alone now distributes more overseas assistance than the entire Italian government. It's estimated that in just its first 2 decades, the overseas vaccine program that Gates runs, which is only a part of what they do, obviously, but their vaccine program alone is estimated to have saved almost 8 million young children. That's not a drop in the bucket in anyone's bucket. And I want to take you a little further. Absorb this. So again, Gates has done some pretty remarkable things here. Well, guess what? Gates's fraction of the total amount of money that America sends overseas to needy people is again, very modest. Religious congregations alone, just churches and synagogues bundling their money together and sending it overseas to poor people, that alone is about 4.5 times what Gates does every single year. And then there's, of course, the non-religious givers. So my point is there's a very big iceberg underneath that tip. And and easy to underestimate it. Another, excuse me. Boy, Syracuse better win because I just sacrificed a mighty set of vocal cords for them. Another complaint that you'll often hear is that philanthropy is not coordinated. You know, you hear that the rules vary so much; they're all over the map. You know, there's no consistency. No one's in control. Is kind of the argument. And what some observers love about government spending is it's the opposite. It's very orderly. You know, it's very uniform. It's very standardized. Everyone is, you know, marching in the same direction. And there's a certain kind of, you know, a certain kind of cramped mind that appeals to you, I guess. But there are some serious problems with standardization, obviously. In human affairs, it can often have very harmful effects. You know, as Carla mentioned, I worked for 3 years in the West Wing, overseeing domestic policy. And any time we would take up a problem, I would think to myself, you know what, no matter what we do, no matter how careful we are, no matter how deeply we think this through, we are going to discombobulate millions of people. It's just inevitable. The dilemma is that the entire federal apparatus swings in one direction every time there's a rule change. That's what rule changes do. Everything is changing. You pull out the rug from underneath a lot of people every time you do that. It's very hard to test competing policies. Many times I wanted to. It's just not really feasible at the federal level. Many times I wanted to kind of turn a faucet on slowly and see what happens. Again, you can't do that. It's all or nothing. The idea of differing solutions for different places is very appealing intellectually, very impossible at the federal level. Now, because humans are not predictable robots, the healthiest, you know, forms of society building, I would argue, are often going to evolve by lots of little experiments and lots of little trials and errors. And yeah, many of the efforts will fail. And the reality is, though, is so long as we aren't all swinging in one direction at the same time, that's just fine, because the failures will be exposed and the errors will cancel themselves out to a large degree, and the successes will be visible, and then people will copy them. So that is an argument for dispersal of resources, for, you know, for divided attacks, for independent assessment, all the things that private philanthropy provides. In 2005, I love the fact that it actually came from a date certain. I figured this out. In 2005, there was a wonderful new word coined to describe what I'm kind of preferring here, to describe a reliance on dispersed authority to fix things, and that word is crowdsourcing. Of course, you know, crowdsourcing is all about, how would you define it? I would say lots of people taking lots of small bites out of big problems that allow them to eventually chew through those big issues. And if you're one of the individual people and you really think hard about it, you think, oh, I'm wasting my time. I can't possibly nail this on my own. But you can't think that way. You have to recognize that you're part of an army. And that's what gives crowdsourcing its power. And the effectiveness of this method has been, you know, really brought into high relief by the computer revolution, obviously. I mean, I'm old enough. When the computer revolution first started to unfold, it was, you know, it was all about machines like this big IBM mainframe computer. But it very quickly became clear that this was not the future, that this was not a particularly powerful method of solving problems, that this was the future. You know, the story of the internet, the entire story of the internet, is the accumulated power of millions of small actions. The lesser of the hacker culture that you see depicted here is that, you know, one man with a laptop can do amazing things. You know, I look at this picture and I think that one man with a laptop is also probably very good for the practice of dentistry, from what I can tell. But, you know, dentists have to make a living too. So there are obviously aspects of this culture that you may or may not find appetizing, but it's clearly a powerful way of solving problems. That's one of the clearest lessons of the last decade or two. So my argument would be that small-scale, decentralized, non-uniform, non-orchestrated problem solving in this model should not be considered a problem for philanthropy or for any other motive aspect of society, for that matter. The next time that you hear philanthropy criticized for being too much of a patchwork, I want to plant a little seed that you can think about. I want you to think about charter schooling. Charter schooling, the very, very largest and most famous and biggest and best funded chain in the whole country in charter schooling, probably most of you know, is the KIPP schools. And the KIPP schools have 183 different schools. Sounds like a lot, right? Well, guess what? There are a total of 7,000 charter schools in this country. That means that the market heavyweight, the big gorilla, has just a tiny fraction of the overall market. Most charter schools, the reality is, are mom and pop operations. They're either single schools or they're parts of a chain of 2 or 3 or 4 schools. So this is, in other words, a radically decentralized sector. And that allows some interesting things to happen. It allows a riot of choices. I mean, I don't know if any of you have spent any time in charter schools. It is a fascinating underworld these days, really fascinating aspect of America. There are math and science schools. There are schools built around the great books. There are work-oriented schools. There are quasi-military academies. There are, hippie schools without doors or windows or controlling features of any sort. There are all kinds of things, much more variety than you will ever find in traditional district-run schools. And the philanthropically backed charter movement is built on the whole idea that there is no single definition of what constitutes a good school. That education is an exercise in matching. It's all about matching. And what you want to do is match each child's gifts and temperaments with an institution that can bring out his or her best self. So, here's a Rorschach blot test for you. When you see that crazy quilt of charter schools, and it is a crazy quilt, you can just walk around this city and poke your head in some of them. You'll be amazed at the varieties. Does that strike you as evidence of, inconsistency and trouble? They don't all look the same. They don't know if they follow the same rules. Or does that ecosystem of options that you'll find strike you as a healthy sign of adaptation to what people want? Which brings us to a final item on the list of alleged weaknesses of philanthropy. The fact that some donors are mean. You'll hear this one for sure. Or they're selfish, or all they want is their name on a building. Well, guess what? It's absolutely true that some people do good works for not such good reasons. And there's absolutely no reason to deny that, in my opinion. So let's close this talk with some acknowledgement that donors aren't all saints. You are looking here, actually you are looking here at J. Paul Getty. J. Paul Getty was a cheapskate who, when he was literally one of the richest men in the world, installed a payphone at his estate to make his guests pay for their own telephone calls. There was actually, some of you may remember this. At one point, his grandson got kidnapped. Okay, remember this? And he was held ransom for $17 million ransom. And so Grandpa was like negotiating with him endlessly, forever. Can you get that down a little bit? Can you reduce that a little further? And to the point where they finally cut off the grandson's ear and mailed it to Grandpa. And at that point, he kind of resigned, and he said, okay. So, but get this, he paid as much of the ransom as is tax deductible. Don't ask me why any ransom is tax deductible, but apparently it is. He paid $2.2 million because that was deductible, and the rest of it he gave to his son as a loan, so he could get grandson out of hostage at 4% interest, by the way. So that's the kind of man we're talking about. Not a sweet and fuzzy man. Nonetheless, the reality is that J. Paul Getty also, with some other part of his brain, gave the world just an absolutely sublime collection of Greek and Roman art that will be elevating souls for centuries to come. Here's one more example, and then I'll close before my voice completely drives you all crazy. You are looking here at Leland Stanford. Listen, folks, I hope there are no cardinals in the audience, but there is absolutely no denying that corruption made Leland Stanford rich. He built his railroad fortune on every trick in the book. They used stock watering, they used collusion. He did all kinds of string pulling, kickbacks, bribes, you named it. He got good at it. Yet, when his son died, genuine grief over this tragedy led him to decide that he was going to use his ill-gotten lucre to benefit the children of California, and ultimately all of us, by building Stanford University. So the message is that, no, philanthropists aren't always pretty. There's no question about that. But here's the really fascinating secret about philanthropy. You don't need to be an angel to participate. The brilliant thing about this mechanism is it will take us just as we are. All the selfish impulses and the noble impulses and the confusions and the wishes and the wants and the vanities of all sorts that swirl together in every one of our breasts, and it will take that and use it in a wondrous way to get good things done, even with our flaws. That's the kind of the genius of the mechanism. So obviously, if I've done nothing else this evening, I hope I've convinced you that philanthropy is just a huge and fascinating and really powerful aspect of our culture. I assure you, I've only scratched the surface of the Almanac. It's a 1,300-page book, and there's a lot of remarkable stories in there. So as you please do grab one, and as you leaf through them, I hope you'll kind of try to keep track of one very profound reality. as I said, there's lots of human interest and fun stuff in there, but there's a deeper message that's terribly important, which is that voluntary giving in this country is not, it's not some sort of acute hobby. It's not just a nice national sideline. It is right at the very heart of our country.